A woman adopted a paralyzed boy in a wheelchair. But one day, noticing something strange, she decided to pretend to leave the house and hid under the bed. What she saw left her terrified. Mary's heart raced as she held Javier's hand, guiding his wheelchair through the threshold of her apartment. At 40 years old, she had never imagined becoming a mother in this way, but here she was welcoming a 12-year-old boy into her home. "Welcome home, Javier," Mary said with a warm smile, closing the door behind them. Javier looked around with curious eyes. "It's nice," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Mary knelt in front of him, searching his gaze. "What would you like to do first? Would you like to see your room?" The boy nodded slowly. Mary pushed the wheelchair down the hallway, stopping in front of a freshly painted door. "Ta-da!" she exclaimed, opening it with a flourish. "Your new kingdom." The room was decorated with bright colors and superhero posters. A low bed, accessible from the wheelchair, occupied one corner. For the first time since they arrived, Javier smiled. Is this for me?" "All yours," Mary confirmed, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Do you want me to help you get settled?" Javier shook his head. "I can do it myself, thanks." Mary watched as the boy skillfully maneuvered his wheelchair around the room, exploring every corner. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me, okay?" While preparing dinner, Mary couldn't stop smiling. The adoption process had been long and exhausting, but seeing Javier in her home made it all worthwhile. "Javier," she called after a while. "Dinner's ready." There was no response. Frowning, Mary walked to the boy's room. Javier, she found him sitting by the window, staring out. "Hey," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Javier jolted, as if waking from a trance. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. It's okay. Come on, let's eat." During dinner, Mary tried to make conversation. "So what do you like to do for fun?" Javier played with his food. "I don't know, read, I guess." "That's great. I have a lot of books. Tomorrow we can check them out to see what you like." The boy nodded, not looking up from his plate. "Javier," Mary said gently, "I know this is a big change. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you can tell me, okay?" Finally, Javier looked at her. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, as Mary was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise coming from Javier's room. She rushed over, finding the boy thrashing in his sleep. "No, please, no," he murmured. "Javier, wake up," Mary said, gently shaking him. "It's just a nightmare." The boy's eyes snapped open, filled with terror. For a moment, he seemed not to recognize her. "It's okay," Mary reassured him. "You're safe." Javier clung to her, trembling. Mary held him, feeling his tears soak through her pajama top. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked after a while. Javier shook his head, pulling away. "I'm fine," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "You can go." Confused by the sudden shift, Mary stood up. "Well, if you need me, I'm just down the hall." The next morning, Mary found Javier already awake, staring out the living room window. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," Javier replied, not taking his eyes off the view outside. Mary frowned, remembering the nightmare. "Are you sure? Last night you seemed pretty upset." Javier turned to her, his face a mask of confusion. "Last night? I don't remember anything." "But I said I'm fine." Javier interrupted, his voice edged with irritation. Mary stepped back, surprised by the sudden hostility. "Okay, I'm sorry. What would you like for breakfast?" The rest of the morning passed in uncomfortable silence. Mary tried to start conversations, but Javier responded with monosyllables or simply ignored her. While washing the dishes, Mary heard a crash from the living room. She rushed in to find a vase shattered on the floor. "Javier, are you okay? What happened?" The boy looked at her with wide eyes. I don't know. I was just sitting here and suddenly, it fell." Mary looked at the distance between Javier and the shelf where the vase had been. It was impossible for him to have reached it from his wheelchair. "Don't worry," she said, forcing a smile. "Accidents happen. I'll get the broom." As she cleaned up, Mary couldn't help but notice Javier's expression. He seemed satisfied. The following days followed a similar pattern. Moments of warmth and connection were followed by inexplicable outbursts of anger or long periods of silence. One afternoon, while Mary was preparing a snack, she heard Javier talking in his room. "I can't. I don't want to." Intrigued, she quietly approached the slightly open door. Javier was alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "You have to do it," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "It's the only way, Javier," Mary called, pushing the door open. "Who are you talking to?" The boy turned, startled. No one, he quickly replied. I was just practicing for a play, Mary nodded, unconvinced. Sure, the snack is ready if you'd like. That night, as Mary was getting ready for bed, she heard a strange noise coming from the living room. She stepped out of her room to investigate and froze. Javier was standing in front of the bookshelf, reaching for a book on the highest shelf. Javier, she whispered in disbelief. The boy turned, his eyes wide. For a second, Mary thought she saw something different in his gaze. Then, as if it had been a trick of the light, Javier was back in his wheelchair, the book in his lap. I wanted to read, he said, his voice shaky. Mary blinked, confused. Had she imagined it? How did you reach that book? I use this, Javier replied, pointing to an extendable grabber next to his chair. I use it for things that are out of my reach, Mary nodded slowly. Of course, I must be tired. Good night, Javier. Back in her room, Mary couldn't shake the image of Javier standing. It was impossible, wasn't it? The doctors had been clear about his condition. The next morning, Mary decided to take Javier to the park. As she pushed him along the paths, she noticed the boy seemed more relaxed than usual. Do you like being outside? She asked. Javier nodded. It reminds me of before. The boy's face darkened. Before the accident, Mary felt a knot form in her stomach. It was the first time Javier had mentioned anything about his past. Do you want to talk about it? Javier shook his head. Not today. They continued in silence until they reached a playground. Mary noticed how Javier watched the other children with a mixture of longing and sadness. Do you want to get closer? She asked. Before Javier could respond, a boy ran up to them. Hi, he greeted cheerfully. Do you want to play? Javier looked at Mary as if seeking permission. Go ahead, she encouraged. I'll be right here if you need me. Mary watched as the other boy pushed Javier's wheelchair toward the adapted swings. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Then, without warning, Javier started screaming, Let go of me, don't touch me. Mary ran to him. Javier was writhing in his chair, his eyes filled with terror. Javier, it's okay, she yelled, trying to calm him down. The other boy backed away, scared. I didn't do anything, he stammered. Mary managed to hold on to Javier, who kept screaming and thrashing. I know, she told the other boy. It's not your fault. Javier, look at me. You're safe. Slowly, Javier calmed down, his breathing still ragged. I'm sorry, he murmured. I don't know what happened. Mary hugged him, feeling how the boy trembled in her arms. It's okay. Let's go home. Back at the apartment, Mary tried to talk to Javier about what had happened, but the boy retreated into stubborn silence. That night, while Mary was cleaning the kitchen, she heard a thud, followed by a muffled cry. She rushed to Javier's room and found him on the floor next to his overturned wheelchair. Javier, she exclaimed, helping him up. Are you hurt? The boy shook his head, but Mary noticed tears in his eyes. Hey, she said gently, sitting next to him on the bed. It's okay to have bad days. Do you want to talk about what happened at the park? Javier tensed. Nothing happened, Javier. I said nothing happened, he shouted, his face contorted with rage. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the anger vanished, replaced by an expression of horror. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. Mary hugged him, feeling the boy relax in her arms. It's okay. We're in this together, remember? No matter what. Javier nodded against her shoulder. Thank you, he whispered. Later that night, as Mary was getting ready for bed, she heard a strange noise coming from the living room. She stepped out of her room to investigate and froze. In the dim light, she saw a figure moving by the window, a figure too tall to be Javier in his wheelchair. Javier, she called, her voice barely a whisper. The figure turned abruptly and in an instant disappeared. When Mary turned on the light, she found the living room empty, with Javier's wheelchair parked in its usual spot. Her heart pounding, Mary walked to Javier's room. She found him asleep, or at least he appeared to be. Confused and frightened, Mary returned to her room. What was happening? Was she imagining things? The next morning, she decided to confront the issue head-on. Javier, she said over breakfast. Last night, did you come out of your room? The boy looked at her with a confused expression. No. Why? Mary hesitated. I thought I saw someone in the living room. For a second, she thought she saw a flash of panic in Javier's eyes. But it disappeared so quickly, she wasn't sure she'd really seen it. It must have been a dream, Javier said, turning his attention back to his cereal. Mary nodded slowly. Yeah, probably, but as she watched Javier, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mood swings, the unexplained incidents, the nightmares. What was really going on with this boy? Javier, she said finally. You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever's happening, we can face it together. Javier looked at her, and for a moment, Mary thought she saw a battle waging behind his eyes. Then the boy smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I know, he said simply. Thanks, Mary. As she cleared the dishes, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing Javier in some way, as if there were an invisible wall between them, growing taller every day. That afternoon, while Mary was working on her computer, she heard a crash coming from Javier's room. She ran in to find the boy on the floor, surrounded by fallen books. Javier, are you okay? The boy nodded, but Mary noticed tears in his eyes. I wanted to reach a book, he mumbled. Mary started picking up the books, but stopped when she noticed something strange on the wall. Stepping closer, she saw with horror a series of deep scratches in the paint. Mary froze, staring at the scratches on the wall. They were too high for Javier to have made them from his wheelchair. Javier, she said slowly, not taking her eyes off the wall. What are these scratches? The boy followed her gaze and visibly paled. I don't know, he stammered. They weren't there before. Mary turned to look at him, noticing the fear in his eyes. Javier, these scratches are too high. How could you have made them? I'm telling you, it wasn't me. Javier suddenly yelled, his voice filled with an anger that made Mary instinctively step back. Okay, she said, raising her hands in a placating gesture. I believe you. But if it wasn't you, who could have done it? Javier looked away, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I don't know, he finally murmured. Maybe an animal got in through the window. Mary glanced at the closed window, then back at Javier. She knew the boy was lying, but why? Javier, she said softly, kneeling in front of his wheelchair, I know something is going on. I don't know what it is, but I want to help you. Please, talk to me. For a moment, it seemed like Javier was going to say something. His lips trembled, and his eyes filled with tears. But then, as if a curtain had dropped, his expression became neutral. There's nothing wrong, Mary, he said in an oddly monotone voice. I'm tired. Can I go to sleep? Mary needed. Sure. Rest well that night. Mary couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, mentally replaying all the strange incidents since Javier had arrived. The moved objects, the unexplained sounds, the sudden mood swings, and now these scratches. None of it made sense. Around midnight, she heard a noise coming from the kitchen. With her heart pounding, she got up and quietly made her way there. What she saw left her frozen in place. Javier was standing in front of the open refrigerator, drinking straight from a carton of milk. Standing, without his wheelchair, Javier. Mary whispered in disbelief. The boy turned abruptly, dropping the carton of milk. For a second, Mary saw an expression of pure terror on his face. Then, before she could react, Javier ran past her and locked himself in his room. Mary stood there in the middle of a pool of spilled milk, trying to process what she had just seen. How was it possible? The doctors had been clear about Javier's condition. Had it all been a lie? With trembling hands, Mary approached Javier's door and knocked softly. Javier, please open the door. We need to talk. There was no response. Javier, I know you're scared. I am too. But whatever is happening, we can face it together. Please let me in. After what felt like an eternity, the door slowly opened. Javier was back in his wheelchair, his head hanging low. Mary entered and sat on the bed facing him. Javier, look at me, she said gently. The boy lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with fear and shame. What I just saw, Mary began. No. Javier interrupted, his voice breaking. Please don't make me go back. I can't go back there. Mary frowned, confused. Go back? Where? Javier started crying, his shoulders shaking with each sob. To the hospital, to the orphanage, wherever. Please, Mary, I'll do anything. I'll be good, I promise. I won't get out of the chair again. I swear. Mary's heart broke at the sight of the terrified boy. She knelt in front of him and took his hands. Javier, listen to me. I'm not sending you anywhere. You're my son now, remember? No matter what happens, we're in this together. Javier looked at her, a mix of hope and doubt in his eyes. You really mean that? Of course I do, Mary affirmed. But I need you to tell me the truth. What's really going on? Javier took a deep breath, as if gathering all his courage. I can walk, he finally admitted. Mary nodded slowly, processing the information. Why did you pretend you couldn't? Because. Javier hesitated, his eyes filling with tears again. Because nobody wants a troubled kid. But everyone feels sorry for a kid in a wheelchair. Mary felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Oh, Javier, I'm sorry, the boy sobbed. I'm so sorry. I know it was wrong to lie, but I was so scared. Nobody wanted me before. Everyone said I was strange, that there was something wrong with me. Mary hugged him tightly, feeling how he trembled in her arms. There's nothing wrong with you, Javier. Nothing at all, but the scratches, Javier murmured against her shoulder, and the things that move. Sometimes I do things and I don't remember doing them. Mary pulled back to look him in the eyes. What do you mean? Javier seemed to struggle with himself for a moment before responding. It's like there's someone else inside me. Someone angry and scared. Sometimes they take control and I can't stop them. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Was Javier describing some kind of multiple personality disorder? Javier, she said as calmly as she could, what you're telling me is very serious. I think we need professional help to understand what's going on. The boy immediately tensed. No, I don't want to see more doctors. They always say I'm crazy. You're not crazy, Mary said firmly. But something is happening and we need to understand what it is so we can help you. Do you trust me? Javier looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. I trust you, Mary. Good, she said, hugging him again. Tomorrow we'll look for help together. But for now, I think we both need some rest. As she helped Javier into bed, Mary couldn't shake a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she was sure of one thing. She wasn't going to abandon this boy, no matter what. Good night, Javier, she whispered, kissing his forehead. Good night, Mom, he replied, closing his eyes. Mary left the room, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned against the wall, letting out a long sigh. The night had been an emotional roller coaster, and she knew this was just the beginning. Maria woke up with a start, her heart pounding. The clock read 3 a.m. A noise from the living room had jolted her out of her restless sleep. Cautiously, she got up and headed toward the door. Asterisk. Javier, she called softly. There was no answer. She moved down the dark hallway, her bare feet making little noise on the cold floor. When she reached the living room, she turned on the light and stifled a scream. The furniture was out of place, as if someone had moved it in the darkness. In the center of the room, Javier sat in his wheelchair, staring blankly out the window. Javier, what are you doing up at this hour? Maria asked, approaching him slowly. The boy turned to her, his eyes glazed and distant. They're coming, he murmured. Who, sweetheart? The ones who live in the shadows, Javier replied, his voice strangely deep. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Come on, it's late. You need to get back to bed. She tried to take control of the wheelchair, but Javier stopped her with surprising strength. No, he shouted. You don't understand, Javier. Please, you're scaring me, Maria said, struggling to keep calm. Suddenly, the boy blinked several times as if waking from a trance. He looked around, confused. Maria? What am I doing here? Maria watched him closely. You don't remember? Javier shook his head, fear evident in his eyes. The last thing I remember is going to sleep. How did I get here? Maria sighed, kneeling in front of him. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're gonna figure it out, okay? As they returned to their rooms, Maria couldn't help but notice the marks on the floor, as if the furniture had been dragged. How could Javier have moved all that from his wheelchair? The next morning, over breakfast, Maria decided to bring up the topic. Javier, about last night, the boy interrupted her. I'm sorry, Maria. I don't know what happened. Sometimes it's like I'm not myself. Maria nodded slowly. I think it's time we seek professional help. How about we go see a doctor today? Javier paled. A doctor? But what if they want to put me in a hospital? I won't let that happen, Maria promised. We're in this together, remember? After several phone calls, Maria managed to get an appointment with a child psychiatrist that same afternoon. While they waited in the clinic's waiting room, Javier fidgeted nervously in his chair. Everything's going to be fine, Maria reassured him, holding his hand. Javier Sanchez, a nurse, called. They entered the office, where they were greeted by Dr. Ramirez, a middle-aged man with a kind smile. Hello, Javier. Hello, Mrs. Maria, she introduced herself. I'm Javier's adoptive mother. The doctor nodded. All right, what brings you both here today? Maria glanced at Javier, who remained silent. We've been experiencing some episodes. What kind of episodes? Dr. Ramirez asked, directing his attention to Javier. The boy lowered his gaze. Sometimes I do things that I don't remember doing. I see, the doctor said, jotting down notes. Can you give me an example? Javier looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. Last night, apparently I got up and moved the furniture in the living room, but I don't remember doing it. Dr. Ramirez frowned. Interesting. And how could you have moved the furniture from your wheelchair? Maria chimed in. That's another thing we wanted to discuss. Javier can actually walk. The doctor looked surprised. He can walk. Then why use the wheelchair? Javier shifted uncomfortably. I was pretending. I thought it would be easier to get adopted if they believed I was disabled. Dr. Ramirez nodded slowly. I understand. Javier, would you mind if I spoke to your mother alone for a moment? The boy nodded and left the office with the nurse. Once alone, the doctor turned to Maria. Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like possible symptoms of a dissociative disorder. The memory lapses, the personality changes. Have you noticed any other unusual behaviors? Maria nodded. Sometimes he speaks with a different voice, deeper. And his eyes, it's like another person is looking at me. I understand your concern, Dr. Ramirez said. I'd recommend a full psychiatric evaluation. We might be dealing with dissociative identity disorder, though it's rare in children this young. What should we do? Maria asked, feeling a mixture of relief at having some direction and fear of the unknown. For now, I suggest we conduct some tests. I'd also like to schedule regular sessions with Javier. And, the doctor hesitated. Given the unpredictable nature of his behavior, it might be wise to take some precautions at home. Maria frowned. What kind of precautions? Perhaps consider installing security cameras, not just for Javier's safety, but also to document these episodes. It could be invaluable for diagnosis and treatment. Maria nodded slowly, uncomfortable with the idea of spying on her adoptive son, but understanding the necessity. That night, after putting Javier to bed, Maria sat in the living room, looking at the boxes of security cameras she had bought on the way home. It's for his own good, she told herself as she began to install them. The next morning, Maria woke up early and went straight to review the night's recordings. Her heart stopped when she saw Javier walking around the living room at 2 a.m., moving objects and talking to himself. We can't go on like this, Javier said in the recording, his voice sounding unnervingly mature. She's starting to suspect. We have to do something. Maria watched in horror as Javier picked up a kitchen knife and began making the same scratches she had seen on the wall of his room. Suddenly, the recording cut off. Maria frowned, checking the camera. It was off. What the hell, she muttered. Good morning, Maria, Javier said, rolling into the living room in his wheelchair. What are you doing? Maria quickly closed the laptop. Nothing, sweetheart. Just checking some emails. How did you sleep? Fine, Javier replied, but Maria noticed the dark circles under his eyes. During breakfast, Maria couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. How could she bring it up without scaring Javier? Javier, she began cautiously, do you remember anything from last night? The boy looked at her, confused. No, why? Did something happen? Maria hesitated. No, nothing. I just thought I heard noises. Javier lowered his gaze to his plate. I'm sorry if I woke you. Sometimes I have nightmares. It's okay, sweetheart. We all do sometimes. That afternoon, while Javier was in his session with Dr. Ramirez, Maria took the opportunity to search his room. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt she needed answers. Under the bed, she found a notebook. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was filled with disturbing drawings, dark figures with claws, red eyes staring from the shadows, and on every page the same phrase repeated over and over. They are coming. What are you doing? Maria turned around, startled. Javier stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of fear and anger. I was cleaning, Maria lied, hiding the notebook behind her back. You're lying, Javier said, his voice deeper than usual. You're always lying. Like everyone else. Javier, it's not what you think, Maria tried to explain, but the boy was already advancing toward her. Give me the notebook, he demanded, extending his hand. Maria backed away. Javier, we need to talk about this. These drawings, they worry me. I said, give it to me. Javier shouted, rising from his wheelchair and lunging at her. Maria screamed, falling backward with Javier on top of her. The boy snatched the notebook from her hands and ran out of the room. Javier, wait, Maria called, getting up and running after him. She found him in the living room, tearing pages from the notebook and throwing them into the lit fireplace. No, Maria screamed, trying to save some of the pages, but it was too late. Javier turned to her, his eyes filled with an emotion Maria couldn't decipher. You shouldn't have seen that, he said, his voice once again that of a frightened child. I'm sorry, Maria. I'm so sorry. Maria approached him slowly, as if she were dealing with a wounded animal. It's okay, Javier. I'm not angry. I just want to understand what's happening. Javier started crying. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like there's someone else inside me, someone who wants to hurt me, hurt us. Maria hugged him, feeling him tremble. We're going to get through this together, okay? I'm not going to abandon you. That night, after putting Javier to bed, Maria called Dr. Ramirez. Doctor, things are getting worse. Today Javier had a violent episode, and those drawings, they were terrifying. I understand your concern, Maria, the doctor replied. I think it's time to consider more intensive treatment options. Perhaps a stay in a specialized clinic. No, Maria interrupted. I'm not going to institutionalize him. There must be another option. Ramirez sighed. We can increase the frequency of the sessions and adjust his medication. But Maria, you must understand that the situation is serious. Javier's safety and your own must be the priority. After hanging up, Maria sat in the living room, staring at the ashes of Javier's drawings in the fireplace. Was she doing the right thing? Or was her desire to be a mother blinding her to the real danger? A noise snapped her out of her thoughts. It was coming from Javier's room. With her heart in her throat, Maria approached the door and opened it a crack. Javier was standing in front of the mirror, talking to himself. We can't go on like this, he said in that deep voice. She's starting to suspect. We have to do something. No, Javier responded in his normal voice. Maria loves us. She can help us. No one can help us, the other voice growled. Only we can protect ourselves. Maria closed the door, her mind spinning. What was she witnessing? Was this what Dr. Ramirez had mentioned about multiple personalities? The next day, Maria decided to work from home so she could keep a closer eye on Javier. The boys seemed normal during breakfast, but Maria couldn't shake the image of what she had seen the night before. Javier, she finally said, do you remember our talk about being honest with each other? Javier nodded slowly. Yeah, why? Last night, I heard you talking to yourself in your room. The color drained from the boy's face. I didn't, it's okay, Maria reassured him. I'm not angry. I just want to understand what's happening. Who is the other voice, Javier? Javier began to tremble. I don't know. He's been with me since forever. He says he protects me, but sometimes what? Maria gently pressed. Sometimes he scares me, Javier whispered. He wants to do bad things. He says it's the only way to keep us safe. Maria took Javier's hands in hers. Listen to me, sweetheart. You're safe here, with me. You don't need that voice to protect you. Javier looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. Do you promise? I promise, Maria said, hugging him tightly. That afternoon, while Javier was taking a nap, Maria decided to check the security camera footage again. To her surprise, all the cameras were off. Maria frowned, certain she had left them on the night before. What's going on here? She muttered to herself, trying to turn them back on. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from Javier's room. She hurried toward it, opening the door with a start. Javier was standing on the bed, ripping the cameras off the corners of the room. Javier, Maria exclaimed. What are you doing? The boy turned to her, his eyes cold and distant. We don't like being watched, he said in that deep voice Maria had come to fear. Javier, come down. We can talk about this, Maria tried to reason, approaching him slowly. Stay back, Javier shouted, throwing one of the cameras at her. Maria barely managed to dodge it. Javier, please. It's me, Maria. I don't want to hurt you, she pleaded, her heart racing. For a moment, Javier's expression softened. Maria, he said in his normal voice, looking around confused. What's happening? Maria took the opportunity to approach and hug him. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. Javier began to cry in her arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to. I don't know why I did that. Shoo, it's okay, Maria consoled him, though her mind was in turmoil. How could she help Javier if she couldn't even rely on the cameras to document these episodes? That night, after putting Javier to bed, Maria called Dr. Ramirez again. Doctor, things are getting worse, she said bluntly. Javier destroyed the cameras. It's like he knew we were watching. Dr. Ramirez sighed heavily on the other end of the line. Maria, I understand your reluctance to consider more intensive treatment options, but I must insist. The situation is becoming dangerous, both for Javier and for you. Maria ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. I know, but I can't abandon him. There has to be another way. There is an option, the doctor said after a pause. It's experimental, but it has shown promising results in similar cases. It involves controlled immersion therapy. Essentially, we would create a safe environment where Javier can confront this other personality under medical supervision. Maria frowned. Wouldn't that be traumatic for him? It could be intense, Dr. Ramirez admitted, but it could also be the key to helping Javier integrate these fragmented parts of his psyche. However, we would need your consent as his legal guardian. Maria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. I need to think about it, she finally said. Of course, the doctor replied, but don't wait too long. The situation could escalate quickly. After hanging up, Maria sat in the darkened living room, weighing her options. On one hand, the idea of subjecting Javier to such intense therapy terrified her. But on the other, what alternative did she have? A noise snapped her out of her thoughts. It was coming from Javier's room. With her heart in her throat, Maria approached the door and opened it a crack. Javier was sitting on the floor, surrounded by pieces of paper. He was drawing frantically, muttering to himself. They have to understand, he said in that deep voice that wasn't his. We can't let them separate us. She doesn't understand. No one understands. Maria watched in horror as Javier filled page after page with disturbing drawings. Dark figures with claws, red eyes staring from the shadows, and in every drawing a figure that looked suspiciously like her, trapped or threatened. She couldn't take it anymore. She burst into the room. Javier. The boy jumped, looking at her with wide eyes. For a moment, he seemed not to recognize her. What are you doing? Maria asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Javier looked at the drawings around him, as if seeing them for the first time. I don't know, he murmured, his voice once again that of a frightened child. Maria knelt next to him, picking up some of the drawings. Javier, these drawings, why are you drawing me like this? The boy began to tremble. It's not me, he whispered. It's him. He says you're a danger, that you want to separate us. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Who is him, Javier? He doesn't have a name, Javier replied, his voice barely audible. He's just always been there. He says he protects me, but what? Maria gently pressed. But sometimes he scares me, Javier admitted, tears fill in his eyes. I don't want to hurt you, Maria, I swear. But sometimes I can't control him. Maria hugged him tightly, feeling the small body of Javier trembling against hers. It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to get through this together. I promise. As she held Javier, Maria made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. They needed help, and they needed it now. The next morning, Maria called Dr. Ramirez before Javier woke up. Doctor, I've made a decision, she said bluntly. I want to proceed with the controlled immersion therapy. I understand, Dr. Ramirez replied, his voice serious. I must warn you, Maria, this won't be easy. Not for Javier, and not for you. I know, Maria said, looking toward Javier's room. But I can't keep watching him suffer. We need to do something. Very well, the doctor said. I'll make the necessary arrangements. In the meantime, I need you to be vigilant for any changes in Javier's behavior. And Maria, be careful. After hanging up, Maria went to Javier's room to wake him up. But when she opened the door, she froze. The room was empty. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the morning breeze. Javier. Maria called, panic rising in her chest. Javier. She searched the house frantically, but there was no sign of the boy anywhere. With trembling hands, Maria called the police. As they began to arrive and ask questions, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much darker. Where was Javier? And more importantly, who or what had taken him? The search began, and with it, the countdown to find Javier before it was too late. Maria's apartment had become a hub of police activity. Officers were coming and going, taking statements and looking for clues about Javier's disappearance. Maria was sitting on the couch, her gaze distant, when the detective in charge approached her. Ma'am, we need you to tell us everything that happened last night, said Detective Gomez, pulling out his notebook. Maria looked at him, her eyes red from crying. I've already told you. I put Javier to bed, talked on the phone with his doctor, and then... Which doctor? Gomez interrupted. Dr. Ramirez, Javier's psychiatrist, Maria replied. We were discussing treatment options for she hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal. For what, ma'am? The detective pressed. Maria sighed. Javier has been having episodes, personality changes, strange behaviors. Detective Gomez frowned. What kind of behaviors? Sometimes he speaks with a different, deeper voice. He does things he doesn't remember later. And the drawings? What drawings? Maria got up and went to Javier's room, returning with some of the drawings she had managed to save. She handed them to the detective. Gomez examined them, his expression growing more serious with each image. Ma'am, do you realize what this looks like? Maria nodded slowly. I know, but you have to understand, Javier isn't dangerous. He's sick, he needs help. At that moment, Maria's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello, she answered, her heart pounding. Maria said a familiar voice on the other end of the line. It was Javier, but he didn't sound like himself. It was that other voice, the one Maria had grown to fear. Javier, where are you? Everyone is looking for you. I'm not Javier, the voice replied, and you won't find us unless I want you to. Maria frantically motioned to the detective, who quickly started tracing the call. Please, Maria begged, don't hurt Javier. He hasn't done anything wrong. The voice laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Hurt. I'm the one protecting him. From you, from the doctors, from everyone who wants to separate us. We don't want to separate you from Javier, Maria tried to reason. We just want to help both of you. Lies, the voice growled. Everyone lies, but I see the truth, and the truth is that Javier is mine. The call abruptly ended. Did you get it? Maria asked the detective. Gomez shook his head. The signal was bouncing between several towers. He could be anywhere in the city. Maria slumped back onto the couch, defeated. What do we do now? The detective looked at her seriously. Now, ma'am, I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning, over the next few hours, Maria recounted every detail of her life with Javier. The adoption, the first signs that something was wrong, the increasingly frequent and disturbing incidents. And you never considered institutionalizing him? Gomez asked. Maria shook her head. I didn't want to abandon him. I thought I could help him myself. The detective sighed. I understand your intentions, ma'am, but this is beyond what you can handle alone. We need to find Javier before he hurts himself or someone else. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city, Javier woke up in an unfamiliar room. He looked around, confused and scared. Where am I? He murmured. Safe, replied a familiar voice. Javier turned and saw his own reflection in a broken mirror. But the reflection was smiling in a way he wasn't. What's happening? Javier asked, his voice trembling. The reflection laughed. We're finally free, Javier. Free from Maria, from the doctors, from everyone who wants to separate us. Javier shook his head. No, this is wrong. Maria loves us. She wants to help us. Lies, the reflection shouted, its voice echoing in the empty room. Everyone lies. They all want to hurt us. But I will protect you, Javier, like I always have. Javier covered his ears, tears streaming down his cheeks. I want to go home. I want Maria. The reflection looked at him with disdain. Maria is not your home. I am your home. I am your family, and soon you will understand. Back at Maria's apartment, the search continued. Dr. Ramirez had arrived and was discussing the case with Detective Gomez. Based on what Maria has told me in my sessions with Javier, the doctor explained, I believe we are dealing with a severe case of dissociative identity disorder. In plain Spanish, Doc asked Gomez. Multiple personalities, Ramirez translated. Javier has created an alternate personality as a defense mechanism against some past trauma. This personality sees itself as a protector, but it's extremely dangerous. Maria, who was listening to the conversation, intervened. But Javier is a sweet child. He would never hurt anyone. Dr. Ramirez looked at her with compassion. The Javier, you know, no. But this other personality, it doesn't have the same moral inhibitions. To it, the end justifies the means. Detective Gomez frowned. Are you saying this 12-year-old boy is capable of... He was interrupted by the sound of his phone. After a brief conversation, he turned to Maria and the doctor. We have a lead. A witness saw a boy matching Javier's description entering an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Maria jumped to her feet. I'm coming with you, ma'am. It's too dangerous, Gomez began, but Maria cut him off. He's my son. I'm going. The detective looked at Dr. Ramirez, who nodded. It might be helpful to have someone Javier knows and trusts. Minutes later, they were on their way. Maria stared out the window of the police car, her mind a whirlwind of worry and guilt. How had it come to this? When they arrived at the abandoned building, the SWAT team was already in position. Remember, Gomez said to his men, "Our target is a 12-year-old boy. Extreme caution." Maria felt her heart stop when she saw the armed officers. "Please," she begged, "don't hurt him." The detective looked at her seriously. "We'll do everything we can to bring him back safely. But you have to understand, the situation is volatile." Inside the building, Javier heard the sound of approaching sirens. "They found us," he said, a mix of relief and fear in his voice. His reflection in the broken mirror smiled. "Just in time, what do you mean?" Javier asked, confused. "It's time for everyone to see the truth," the reflection replied. "It's time for Maria to understand that she will never separate us." Javier felt himself losing control of his body. He watched in horror as his hands picked up a shard of broken glass. "No," he whispered. "Please, don't do this." The reflection laughed. "Don't worry, Javier. Soon, you'll understand that this is necessary." Outside the building, the SWAT team was preparing to move in when Maria saw a figure in one of the upper windows. "It's Javier," she shouted. Everyone looked up. Javier was standing at the window holding something shiny in his hand. "Javier," Maria called. "Please come down. We're here to help you." The voice that responded wasn't Javier's. "Lies. Everyone lies." Dr. Ramirez approached Maria. "That's the other personality. We need to be careful." Maria nodded, taking the megaphone an officer handed her. "Please," she said, her voice amplified. "I know you're scared. I know you think you're protecting Javier, but this isn't the way. You don't understand anything," the voice shouted. "Javier is mine, and if I can't have him, no one will." Horrified, everyone watched as Javier raised the shard of glass, bringing it dangerously close to his neck. "No," Maria screamed, running toward the building before anyone could stop her. "Ma'am, wait," Gomez shouted, but Maria was already inside. She raced up the stairs, her heart pounding. When she reached the floor where Javier was, she found him standing in the middle of the room, the glass still in his hand. "Javier," she said softly, approaching slowly. The boy looked at her, but his eyes were cold, distant. It wasn't Javier who was looking at her. "Stay back," the voice growled. "Please," Maria begged. "I know you think you're protecting Javier, but this isn't protection. It's destruction." "You don't know anything," the voice screamed. "I've been with Javier forever. I protected him when no one else did." Maria took another step forward. "I know, and I thank you for that. But Javier isn't alone anymore. He has me. He has us both." For a moment she saw doubt in Javier's eyes. "Lies," the voice said, but it sounded less sure. "I'm not lying," Maria replied. "I love you both, Javier and you. You're part of each other, and you're part of me." Javier blinked, confused. "Maria," he said, his own voice returning. "I'm here, sweetheart," she replied, extending her hand. "Let's go home." Javier looked at the glass in his hand, then at Maria. Slowly, he let the glass fall. At that moment, the SWAT team burst into the room. Javier screamed, frightened, and Maria ran to hug him. "It's okay," she reassured him. "You're safe, you both are." Hours later at the hospital, Maria waited outside Javier's room while the doctors examined him. Dr. Ramirez approached her. "How is he?" Maria asked. "Physically, he's fine," the doctor replied. "Mentally, well, we have a long road ahead," Maria nodded. "What happens now?" "Intensive therapy," Ramirez said. "We need to help Javier integrate his personalities. It won't be easy, but with the right support, it's possible." "Can I see him?" Maria asked. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but remember, Javier is very fragile right now. Both personalities are fighting for control." Maria entered the room. Javier was sitting on the bed looking out the window. "Hey," she said softly. Javier turned to her. For a moment, Maria saw fear in his eyes, but then the boy smiled timidly. "Hi, Maria." She sat on the bed next to him. "How do you feel?" Javier hesitated, confused, scared. I'm so sorry, Maria, for everything." Maria hugged him tightly. "You don't have to apologize. We're in this together, remember?" Javier nodded against her shoulder. "Even after everything that happened, even knowing that that we are." "Especially because of that," Maria replied. "You're my son, Javier, all the parts of you, and I love you no matter what." Javier started crying, and Maria held him, rocking him gently. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to walk it with Javier, step by step. Outside the room, Dr. Ramirez watched the scene through the window. He took out his phone and dialed a number. "Yes, it's me," he said when someone answered. "We found him. Yes, both personalities are present. No, he's not ready for phase 2 yet. We need more time." He hung up and looked toward the room again, where Maria was still holding Javier. The real test was just beginning.